Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you here this evening. My name is Louis Johnston. I'm a professor in the economics department, and I also am, I think I'm a vice president of our local Phi Beta Kappa chapter. I don't even know what my title is, but I do this stuff, so welcome. I just want to do three things. I want to thank a few people, say a few words about the program, the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program, that is, and then introduce tonight's speaker. After the presentation, we'll have opportunity for audience questions, and since I'm doing this, I reserve the right to ask the first one if I feel like it, but otherwise, everybody's welcome to ask questions. First up, thank yous to the Phi Beta Kappa Theta of Minnesota chapter and all of the members, the McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, especially Stacy Pink, who makes all this stuff happen, and all of the staff here at St. John's who made dinner, served dinner, set up the room, and did all the work that makes an event like this happen. Thank you very much. Second, I want to mention a couple of things about the program itself. This is from the Phi Beta Kappa Society's description of the program itself. So this is a quote. Since 1956, the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program has been offering undergraduates the opportunity to spend time with some of America's most distinguished scholars. The purpose of the program is to contribute to the intellectual life of the campus by making possible an exchange of ideas between the visiting scholars and the resident faculty and students. The visiting scholars travel to 100 colleges and universities each year, spending 2 days on each campus and taking full part in the academic life of the institution. They meet informally with students, faculty members, participate in classroom discussions, give a public lecture open to the academic community and the general public. And over the past 60 years, 648 visiting scholars have made 5,288 visits, according to Phi Beta Kappa, to Phi Beta Kappa sheltering institutions. Finally, but certainly not least, let me introduce our visiting scholar, Dr. David Wyman. As you can see from the slide, he is the Elena Wells Hirshhorn Class of 1958 Professor of Economics, and is also an affiliated member of the graduate faculty in the Columbia University Department of History. He is also the faculty director of Barnard's Empirical Reasoning Center. He earned his undergraduate degree from Brown, his master's degree from Yale, and his doctoral degree from Stanford University. Dr. Wyman specializes in 19th and 20th century U.S. economic history and the political economy of contemporary U.S. criminal justice policy. And among his most recent publications in economic history are pieces on the political economic limits to the Fed's goal of a common national bank money, Main Street and Wall Street, macroeconomic consequences of the New York bank suspensions from 1866 to 1914. And in fact, he's currently completing a paper called Toward a More Perfect Monetary Union, the Civil War as a Second American Revolution, which is part of a larger co-authored study on the formation of the American Monetary Union, ranging from Andrew Jackson's Bank War to the formation of the Fed. So tonight, Dr. Wyman will discuss another aspect of his work that I mentioned a moment ago, the origins and labor market impacts of this regime we're living in of mass incarceration. So join me in welcoming Dr. David Wyman.
So I want to thank the local Phi Beta Kappa chapter for inviting me. It's interesting, when I got the letter from Phi Beta Kappa, I was really shocked, actually. And it's sort of that distinguishing scholar, kind of notion. It reminded me of a Three Stooges episode when they're referred to as gentlemen, and they said together, "Who walked in?" Right? So. But anyway, it's really been a privilege. I've actually spent a lot of my life, from one way or another, traveling around the country, and this is an opportunity to visit lots of institutions and places that I have not been. And I also want to thank especially Louis, who's really done a wonderful job orchestrating this. I realize, everyone says, "Oh, it's such, you're traveling, you're doing this and that." And I think, but I know that the individuals who've hosted me in the three talks that visits I've had have devoted lots of effort into making them as smooth as possible, and this one has really been a pleasure, except for the fact that he can't control the weather. So tonight my talk is a little bit different, titled differently from the announced presentation, partly because it's in some ways the same topic except looked at from a slightly different perspective, and thinking about the social costs of mass incarceration. As As Lewis indicated, this is not my main research suit. I actually spent some time working in the Russell Sage Foundation as a program officer, and I was assigned the task, literally, of creating a working group of scholars to address the issue of mass incarceration in the United States. It wasn't really even thought of that way. There was actually, that terminology is actually pretty current and recent. But recognizing that mass incarceration has actually afflicted a sort of distinct segment of the U.S. Population, and especially of the labor market. And so our goal was to try to understand what its consequences would be for individuals who had actually spent considerable time in prison because of this shift in criminal justice policy. So I'm going to read this talk. I was trying to kind of make sure I can compress it in the time frame, and I'm not sure I've actually succeeded, but I'll try not to read too quickly. The prison was originally conceived for the purpose of rehabilitating criminal offenders, yet critics from its very inception worried that the cure actually reinforced the criminal behavior of its occupants. In modern parlance, they regarded the prison as an inherently criminogenic institution. This line of criticism is most relevant today when a potent rationale for U.S. criminal justice policy, which we call mass incarceration, is the public safety benefits from incapacitating actual offenders, that is, locking them up in prison, and also deterring potential ones. And by the way, just by way of definition, when I speak of mass incarceration, I mean, it's got many dimensions to it, but what we're really talking about is this period from 1973, as you can see, but especially 1980, up to about, and again, especially really it's the end of the 20th century. This is 1998, thereabouts, when the U.S. Incarceration rate, measured as the number of prison inmates per 100,000 of the population, increased nearly fivefold, from about 100 to over 500. And of course, many of you know that the U.S. now incarcerates, relative to its population, more people than any other country in the world. So our goal was to discover whether, well, again, if the prison experience hardens criminal offenders, then of course the incapacitation effect is transitory. Because, as Jeremy Travis tells us, they all come back, they all return to their communities. And obviously, if they're now enmeshed in gangs, and they're actually more serious, committing more serious crimes, then of course that obviously diminishes the safety of their communities. And at the same time, because the mass incarceration regime has targeted especially communities of color and young men in particular, it has normalized the prison experience for those populations, which of course then undermines what was a very powerful deterrent, namely the stigma of having a prison record. So this classic argument about prison identifies at least one potential social cost of mass incarceration, which is that it may temporarily improve public safety, but at the same time it ultimately yields harm to communities and to individuals who are caught up in this net. But it actually has even broader impacts, namely that when individuals are locked up, it actually not only obviously deprives them of their livelihood during this period, and I found one striking piece, an epidemiologist who used the methodology of lives lost, which is actually a term in thinking about premature death because of the lack of health care, and he used that lives lost to calculate what was the harm done to those incarcerated that probably didn't have to be. But it also affects dramatically families, and notably children, communities. It weakens social capital and social control mechanisms within communities. And obviously it has quite significant fiscal consequences. So our goal was actually, in this research agenda, was to further extend the boundaries of this analysis of the social costs of incarceration by examining, in essence, the recidivism costs that might arise because those imprisoned actually might find themselves in circumstances upon their release that induce them actually to commit further crimes and ultimately to return to prison through further commitments for new felony convictions. So what we're examining is what's the probability that once incarcerated, that increases the likelihood that prisoners will, in fact, cycle in and out of prison repeatedly because their life chances have been so compromised by that prison experience. And we focus on the labor market because, you know, the sociologists tell us that the labor market as a critical formative institution is at least provides one mechanism for what they would refer to as desistance, the process by which those who had committed crimes or inclined to commit crimes essentially wind up going straight. So what we argue, and what I will argue, and I'm kind of breezing through this just to make sure I have enough time for questions. Basically, I'm just going to come down to this. Basically, and I'm going to come back to this. What we're going to argue is that basically what a prison experience does, so that's our hypothesis, is to derail the process, the critical life course transition that most kids experience as they transition into adulthood from oftentimes, especially those with, say, less education, more disadvantaged conditions, they transition from a secondary labor market into something that looks more like a primary labor market with more stable employment and higher and greater prospects for stable employment and for wage increases. So if we think about it, the way we're going to frame this problem is that, you know, kids in their late adolescence and as they're moving into early adulthood, they spend some period churning in the labor market, and so we characterize that as a period in which their unemployment is relatively stable. They're kind of going in and out of jobs, so you don't really see any trend increase in the amount of time worked, say, over the course of a year. And their earnings are relatively stagnant, so we could think of this as either employment rates or average wages. But eventually, if, again, they avoid prison experience or something like that, they eventually find a good job match. And once they find that match, they sort of just jump on kind of an escalator, so to speak, in which they sort of see more stable employment opportunities. So their weeks worked over the course of the year tend to rise. They also see their wages and maybe other benefits tend to rise, so their annual earnings are increased. And so this is, again, the normal kind of age earnings profile that we would expect to see for, you know, young adults heading into their mature years. Our argument is that the prison spell here, for those who are caught up in that net, derails that process. And effectively what it does is it just keeps these individuals in the secondary labor market. So the analysis I'm just going to frame in terms of a secondary labor market hypothesis. We want to find evidence to see whether, in fact, this becomes the plight of those released from prison, and if these conditions of churning, you know, in and out of really dead-end jobs, if this is what inclines individuals to commit crimes to begin with that make them vulnerable to the mass incarceration net, then we would expect, of course, the same set of conditions as they're older to kind of continue, and so they would find themselves more inclined to commit crimes, to offend, and then also to be incarcerated. Right? So my argument, and in some ways it's kind of conventionally economic. What I do is I sort of begin by looking at the labor market for released prisoners, and I think of it in terms of a supply side and a demand side. And so on the supply side, sort of looking at things like the human capital of released prisoners, how much education they have, what's their, you know, kinds of networks that they find themselves in that might provide contacts into the labor market, what neighborhoods they locate in, which may also, you know, provide them with labor market opportunities and enhance their labor supplies and so forth. And then I look at the demand side, and again, our evidence from these projects were stronger on the demand side, in which we literally surveyed employers and asked them, you know, about their willingness to hire individuals with criminal backgrounds and under what conditions they might. And so we have data on that. We also have evidence on employers' hiring of ex-offenders, and, you know, in what kinds of jobs, what kind of sectors, you know, and under what conditions. I also will refer to work that was done outside of the Russell Sage project by notably sociologist Diva Pager, who conducted audit studies. She was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin at the time. She sort of hired a bunch of UW graduate students to pose as, in some cases, just young adults looking for work, in some cases young adults with criminal backgrounds. And she matched, you know, she had, you know, whites, blacks, so she could also look at the racial division in the results of their job searches. So we look at that on the demand side and see what the prospects are for employers, you know, to what extent they're willing to hire released prisoners, the extent to which they do. And then finally, we look at the actual experiences of those who had actually spent time in prison in the labor market to see whether, in fact, we see evidence of this kind of stagnation in their employment prospects. So let me just head back for a second. So again, that's the period. Just one other point, and we talk about mass incarceration. Obviously, on the one hand, you know, mass incarceration did target inner city communities of color largely, and especially young men with less education. And you know, you can see the evidence of that in terms of what sociologists think of as the cumulative risk of incarceration, which is the probability that any individual in this particular, you know, racial ethnic population will spend some time in prison. And you can certainly see that, and when I talk about the normalization of incarceration experience, especially by black men, you can see that for the entire population of black males, the lifetime likelihood of spending time in prison is almost a third. Now, that actually looks at all African American men across all, say, educational groups, all socioeconomic classes. So we can get those data readily, but we can also estimate, for example, how those risks vary by education. And what we find actually through several of our studies is that those individuals have at best a high school degree, right? Then those probabilities approach 50%. So in that sense, you know, one way Bruce Western, sociologist, who's written extensively on this, the way he tries to relate it to the experiences of, say, white populations is that for a young black man, they're more likely to go to prison than they are to go to college, right? So that would be, again, a comparable risk, right? You would like to say that those students out here, you're at risk of graduating and getting a BA, although we don't tend to think of it quite that way. But it's interesting if you look at, and just for the record, if you actually look at, for other populations, so whites, Hispanics, what you see, so this is actually, doesn't come across as clearly from this grid here, but this is the Latino population, this is the white population. The actual increase in the risks as a percentage increase from a baseline is actually the same. It just turns out that black started off at a higher baseline. So it's in certain ways, essentially, this is affecting all essentially less educated, less skilled individuals who are struggling in the labor market and turn to crime as an alternative, oftentimes alternative source of income. And I'm going to focus on that particular group. In the case of the drug trade, they're called jugglers. And the reason why they're called jugglers is because they're kind of juggling lots of different activities. They're going back and forth in between sort of illicit and totally licit labor market activities. But this is really strategies that they devise in order to essentially make ends meet. And in some cases, they have, you know, addictions which they have to feed, and that sort of obviously increases, you know, the threshold levels of income which they need to earn. Another way of thinking about a juggler, and I'll use this terminology as well, is we think of these are basically marginal offenders. And so again, this notion of a marginal offender, it has two different connotations to it. So one comes from criminologists, and what they're literally looking at is what is the propensity to offend, especially to commit serious crimes by individuals. So marginal offenders, you know, they offend less, they are less inclined to commit crimes, and they also tend to commit less serious crimes, meaning, say, nonviolent, victimless crimes. So again, the drug buying and even some drug selling might fall into that category. For economists, a marginal offender is basically on the margin between working in the illegal and legal markets. And that's really going to depend on a variety of economic considerations. So in this particular case, the notion of marginal applies equally to both. I mean, in that sense, it's synonymous. That the marginal offenders criminologically are also the marginal offenders economically. And so I can use that term interchangeably when I'm talking about this particular population. Finally, I just want to make one other comment about why I focus on the war on drugs. And the answer is because the war on drugs is important. So the one thing about drug crimes and drug arrests is that the reality is we don't know the extent of criminal activity in drug selling and also drug using. In fact, the only way that we actually are able to glean information about illegal drug use, for example, is through surveys of individuals to ask them whether they have used whatever types of illegal substances, say in the past week or the past month. And what is really striking about those studies is what they show is that, in fact, whites tend to use drugs relatively more than African Americans, despite the fact that more African Americans are arrested for drug use crimes than whites are. And the other thing about, so we get these, I just have here as a kind of relative benchmark, these property crimes, violent crimes. So in a way, one way to think about it, and this is about as much as I can really say about the origins of mass incarceration, what you can see has been there's a steady climb in drug arrests. And again, we're measuring usually per 100,000 of the population. And that's true, by the way, continuing to arrest for drug possession and drug dealing, despite the fact that, as we know, sometime in the mid-1990s, crime rates across the board began to fall and fall quite sharply. So there's a sense in which the continued sort of mass incarceration, prosecuting the war on drugs, seemed to operate somewhat independently of what was occurring more broadly in terms of criminal offending throughout the population. But what is actually very important is this particular episode, in the history of the drug trade and also of violent crime. This is a period in which there's a kind of epidemic of fatal handgun, crime, which is associated with the crack epidemic, which is also then associated with this kind of run-up in the drug arrests. And so, in effect, literally, what happened was that this particular experience, really had a formative impact in influencing much of criminal justice policy in the 1990s, in which we really do see the acceleration of arrests and incarceration, especially for drug crimes. And much of the increase in the prison population over this period can be accounted for by those who are committed for violations, oftentimes of just a drug possession laws. All right, so let me turn to the economics, and so this is a pretty busy chart. So again, a lot of the way we're actually going to glean our information about, again, supply and demand conditions for released prisoners is literally through survey evidence, in which, in this case, individuals who were about to be released from prison were interviewed by scholars, researchers, this case from Urban Institute in a returning home project, which they conducted over several years. So let me just begin, and I'm going to return to the text, just say that the supply factors here, enumerated here, specify the personal characteristics and social attachments, or you can think of it as social capital, that influence an individual's job prospects. So if the survey responses can be taken at their word, then inmates on the verge of release were eager to find a job, which is what they claim, but realistically worried about their prospects. The vast majority regard employment as important, and that's a quotation, especially if they want to go straight and avoid a return trip to prison. At the very least, their labor force participation will satisfy their parole officers. Still, to many ex-offenders, a job will help to repair their frayed familial relations, friendships, and finances, and so minimize their opportunities and inducements to engage in criminal behavior. Despite their overall positive attitudes, 30 to 60% of prisoners expected to encounter difficulties along the way. Prior to their incarceration, at most half had finished high school or its equivalent, and only a small fraction had some college education. Around 2/3 reported work experience, but most often in the informal, not the formal sector. Strikingly, while in prison, relatively few availed themselves of the training programs and work opportunities to remedy these gaps. Only 7% of about-to-be released prisoners in Ohio had actually earned a GED certificate while in prison, and the take-up and completion rates for vocational programs was even lower at about 3%. The extent of prison employment, especially just prior to release, tended to vary. More important, participation in work release programs was actually relatively rare, and as I'll suggest, that actually is a problem because the work release programs seem to be the most effective training programs in ensuring that released prisoners can find jobs after they exit their incarceration. Prisoner surveys also provide indirect evidence on the potential importance and actual impact of familial and social attachments. The vast majority of prisoners admitted that they would need help from family members, friends, neighborhood organizations. And in the follow-up surveys, they report significant reliance on family and friends for financial support, housing, and job contacts. Geographic location exerts a powerful influence on ex-inmates' job prospects and social networks. Approximately one-half are released to their old communities, despite high rates of unemployment, poverty, residential turnover, and other indicators of socioeconomic disadvantage and disorder. Consequently, they did not perceive their communities as good places to find work, and they actually feared that they would be lured back to their old ways. These conditions enhanced the value of families and friends, at least for released prisoners determined to change their ways. To find a job, many reported commute times averaging 45 minutes to an hour and relied heavily on family and friends for transportation instead of the often indirect, unreliable public systems. For the other half who relocated, family members frequently took the initiative. As one reason for moving, they cited favorable socioeconomic and employment conditions, but also the desire to wrest ex-offenders from their dysfunctional social networks. On the demand side of the equation, released prisoners worried about employers' negative reactions to their prison record. Now here we use evidence culled from recent employer surveys, which corroborates their general concerns. Evidence from the surveys were conducted in 1992 and 94. So again, if you recall your brief macroeconomic history, you'll know that those are the years after the recovery of what turned out to be a rather sharp business cycle downturn. That's the "it's economy stupid" kind of period that got Bill Clinton elected to office. And then we re-interviewed some of those employers in 2001 in LA. And so again, recent economic history will tell you that that is actually the peak of the Bill Clinton economic boom that began in the mid-1990s. So these surveys in some ways generally corroborate the concerns of the prisoners. In the initial surveys, managers were asked whether they would be more or less willing or unwilling to hire someone with a criminal record. Over 60% indicated their reluctance, and only 12.5% said that they definitely will. By way of comparison, at least 80% would consider hiring individuals from other stigmatized groups, like welfare and GED recipients and the long-term unemployed. They were additionally wary of those individuals with long gaps in their work histories, which they took as an indication that they had spent some time in prison. The sustained economic boom of the late 1990s ultimately trickled down to the less skilled labor market, but only modestly altered managers' doubts about ex-offenders. And here, this is the data from LA in the 2001 surveys. In the follow-up survey of Los Angeles area market, employers were given the same dichotomous choice, willing, unwilling to hire, but interestingly, many qualified their response. So this is a case where they just told the survey staff it's not that simple. And what they wound up telling them was that they were unwilling to hire someone. 43% said they were unwilling to hire someone with a criminal record, so that's down from the 60%, because an additional 36% now hinged their hiring decisions on the nature of the applicant's crime. So when probed further, managers stated a clear preference for more marginal ex-offenders, there's that marginal notion showing up again, who had been convicted of economic rather than violent crimes, so again, burglary and drug trafficking being the two that they actually identified. They also favored more seasoned ex-inmates who had been out of prison longer and already had had some work experience. Now you can see this is a catch-22. You can't get a job until you have a job. But again, you can also see the value of the work release program, which actually gives them some job experience, outside of the prison walls. In a sense, gives them a reference that they can use as they shop around in the labor market. Again, by way of contrast, the labor demands for other stigmatized groups, like single women exiting the welfare rolls, were more cyclically sensitive, as evidenced by the dramatic surge in the labor force participation rates of those women since the mid-1990s. Additional survey evidence corroborates these findings. Firms were more willing to consider ex-offenders. They had, in fact, hired them 3 to 5 times more often in the past year than those that were unwilling. And those adverse to hiring all or some ex-offenders tended to check applicants' criminal backgrounds more frequently than those who said that they were willing. The use of this screen, the criminal background check, is strongly correlated with firms' location in inner city minority communities and the corresponding racial ethnic composition of their applicant pool. Paradoxically, perhaps, for firms averse to hiring ex-offenders, routine criminal background checks actually increase the probability that they would hire a young, less skilled African American man. And by the way, this is a very important point, and I'll elaborate, I'll say something about it. But again, this is a controversial issue. It's tied up with the Ban the Box movement. But it turns out that in this case, being able to check the backgrounds of young African American men showing up at their doors, applying for jobs, being able to check those backgrounds actually made employers more likely to hire them than not. So if the Los Angeles case is at all representative, then the use of criminal background checks has increased sharply over the past decades. Firms are responding to a more complex legal environment surrounding the employment of ex-offenders. An increasing number of occupations have been ruled off limits to ex-offenders, or at least the more serious ones. Like bizarrely, they can't be barbers or hairstylists. Licensing for that is prohibited in many states. And based on recent judgments, employers now face a significant civil liability for negligent hiring by failing to check criminal backgrounds of employees, and so exposing their workers or customers to harm. Just as an aside, in response to these growing demands, a new industry has mushroomed to provide low-cost criminal background information, often via the internet. Unlike more established credit reporting sector, these smaller fledgling enterprises have eluded quality control regulations, and at least one study have been shown to be less reliable than more costly, slower official sources. The uncertain quality of this information source is especially troubling because firms use criminal background checks preemptively to screen applicants. The survey evidence also specifies the kinds of jobs open to ex-offenders. For obvious reasons, firms tend to hire ex-offenders are located in the manufacturing, construction, and transportation public utilities sector, as opposed to retail trade or service industries. Moreover, within these sectors, larger rather than smaller firms are more likely to employ released prisoners. These larger firms contain formal human resources departments, which can more readily keep abreast of legal developments and access criminal background information, but can also effectively segregate ex-offenders in operating divisions where they are less likely to cause harm to the firm or to others around them. Recent audit studies of the Milwaukee area and New York City low-skilled labor markets furnish an alternative view of employers' responses to and demands for released prisoners. Now, by design, an audit study can control for a variety of confounding factors ranging from personal appearance to educational work history, and so train employers' focus on key factors, in this case, criminal and prison records and the race, ethnicity of the applicant. So again, the idea of an audit study, they were actually pioneered in the residential housing market, in which black couples and white couples with essentially identical backgrounds by construction presented themselves to real estate agents to see, to look for a house. And of course, the question was whether they'd be discriminated against in terms of which neighborhoods, what kinds of houses, or whether they'd be shown any houses at all by real estate agents. So literally that's what's happening here. Basically paired individuals, the identical sort of backgrounds, even identical scripts. They even work so that they actually speak almost identically, so the elocution is the same. So the only difference really is whether you're presented with someone who's white or African American, someone who does or does not have the criminal background on their record. All right. So regardless, and again, this is, there, and by the way, these only have just one conviction and one prison spell. So that's, so this is actually not even the juggler that I was thinking of, who's going back and forth, drug use and arrest and incarceration. So regardless of an applicant's race and ethnicity, a criminal prison record severely deflated their employment prospects, measured by the likelihood of receiving a callback. So again, what you have here is, again, the way we're going to actually look at the demand for the labor, and all you can do is just say you're going to apply for a job, and you'll see whether the employer calls you back and just schedule an interview. So, so here you've got prison record, white, no, yes. So again, African American, no, yes. So again, what you're looking at, sort of just straightforward, is looking at the prison record. Are they more likely or less likely to get a callback? So it's going to vary, because it turns out in some cases, the firms are in different locations, firms are in different sectors, and in some instances, we'll talk about, individuals actually had some personal contact with the hiring manager. They happened to apply for the job, and the hiring manager happened to be there and actually granted them a, off-the-cuff, interview in which the individuals were able to explain their circumstances. Right? So for white applicants, the chances of a callback fell by 1/2, from 34 to 17%, if they had a prison record. The prison effect was even greater for African American men, whose overall prospects were rather dim to begin with. Black applicants with a clean record, received callbacks only 17% of the time. So if you recall, that's the percentage for whites who actually had a criminal record, right? So the additional impact of a criminal record lowered their employment chances by over 2/3 to only 5%. The more recent and larger New York City experiment confirms this basic finding, that a white ex-offender has approximately the same callback rate as Latino and African American men with a clean record. Milwaukee study detects the subtle influence of tacit information conveyed through direct personal contact with the hiring manager. About 1/4 of the time, black and white applicants met face-to-face with the manager. Those with a criminal record could kind of plead their case. And despite carefully rehearsed scripts, the delivery only worked for white, not for black offenders, ex-offenders. This interaction increased their likelihood of a callback from 9 to 42%, which actually exceeded the 28% for whites who had a clean record, actually. So being able to, a white saying, I made a mistake, I want to go straight, giving me a job is going to help me, seem to work. By contrast, personal contact only improved the employment prospects of African American men with a clean record from 7 to 36%, still below the rate for white ex-offenders who met with the hiring manager. Callback rates for black men in the other cells, including those with a clean record but no personal contact, were comparably low, about 6 to 7%. The last two columns show the influence of geography and sectoral location of firms by the race and prison record of the applicants. Consistent with the spatial mismatch hypothesis, less educated applicants, with one notable exception, had a greater chance of finding a job in a suburban rather than an urban location. The one exception, not surprisingly, were African Americans with a prison record whose overall poor prospects faded by 1/2 in the suburbs. Race clearly mattered in this context, but was a more formidable barrier to service sector jobs that required close customer contact, such as restaurant service. In this case, African American men, regardless of their prison record, were much less likely to receive callbacks than their white counterparts. Most surprising is the much greater willingness of restaurants to consider white men with a prison record than African American men without a prison record, by a margin of 23 to 7%. To determine the impact of these labor market conditions, researchers have carefully analyzed whether a prison record diminishes the labor market prospects of ex-inmates and how their experiences in prison affect their labor market outcomes. The first question implicitly contrasts the labor market trajectories of ex-inmates with those who were at risk of incarceration but avoided prison. Right? So how does that happen? You're basically arrested, but you are not prosecuted. or even if you're prosecuted and you plead, you're basically given, essentially released on parole. So the bottom line is you just don't go to prison, you don't have a prison record. Right? The second set of examines the varied labor market experiences of ex-inmates, for example, whether they participated in training programs, educational, vocational, and also how much time they spent in prison. So this is, by the way, the implicit comparison. Again, this is the context in which I use this, we're talking about. So they say these are two identical individuals, right, who start off their lives roughly the same time. Maybe, what are they doing? They're like stealing hubcaps. So I'm thinking that's basically a 1950s or 60s crime. So they're selling drugs. Some of them are able to outrun the cops, others are not. Whatever it is, right? Some of them elude the cops, the others actually fall in the net, and this turns out to be the differential experience that they have in terms of their age earnings profiles, in terms of employment rates and wages. So we can think of a prison record effect. It's not really a diminishing, right, of their labor market prospects from where they started off, but rather it's not hopping on the escalator. And so we're trying to gauge this differential, how large this is, again, through this comparison, by sort of examining the actual experiences of those with and without. So here's the evidence, actually. So this comes from work that was done on a national longitudinal survey of youth. So it's fortunate for us in terms of researchers that this is a survey that kind of follows, sort of late teens, early adolescence. As they're moving into adulthood, they try to locate them, several waves, several times over the course of their life, and they try, again, follow-up studies to examine how they have fared in terms of a variety of measures, including their labor market experience. They don't, and at least explicitly admit to being in prison, but at various times during the interview process, some of them were actually located in prison. And so, their address was actually a prison address, and that's how we know that they experienced prison or not, right? So, again, the nature of the analysis here is you're really comparing those with and without. And here what we're doing is we're looking at, again, the relative employment rates of those who had a prison record compared to those without. So 90%, for example, again, this would be for white men that say that their employment prospects, the amount of time they worked over the course of a year, diminished by 10% relative to those without a prison record. So for African Americans, it's about a little bit under 15%, about 15%, and Hispanics about 14%. Same thing for hourly earnings, right? That's essentially, you think of that as the average wage that they earned. If you just multiply the employment effect by the average hourly earnings effect, you get the total annual earnings effect. And so what that says is, roughly speaking, and by the way, this is comparable across all groups. Statistically, you can't distinguish this prison effect, is that basically it diminishes their overall annual earnings by about a third. Now let me just begin by saying we're also not talking about individuals who have very, very robust employment prospects to begin with. So they're actually on the margin to start off with, and then they're basically paying a tax of about a third having experienced prison. And this, by the way, 1/3 is not a one-shot tax, right? This is actually a tax over their life course. So these cumulative effects are derived from a statistical analysis that directly corroborates, and that's this secondary labor market hypothesis. In their early adulthood, workers tend to settle into jobs with improved long-term prospects, realize steadier employment, rapid earnings growth, right? Although, again, none of them fared particularly well in the new economy. But compared to their peers who had never been incarcerated, growth rates of wages were slower for those who had been incarcerated by 20 percentage points for whites, 15 percentage points for blacks. Moreover, black ex-inmates worked 40% less time in their current jobs, which is evidence of their continued churning in and out of the secondary labor market. So the second body of research is actually looking at individuals in prison and then tracking what happened to them when they were released from prison. So this is, again, just by way of the research strategy. This is using administrative records coming from a variety of states, departments of correction. So much of this is confidential, and so our access to these data depend on the state's willingness to cooperate with researchers. So you have some states that are completely open record states like Florida, and so we were able to conduct pretty detailed, in-depth studies of Florida. New York State was actually much more restrictive in releasing this information. So again, it's a very opportunistic strategy. Fortunately for us, we were able to look at records in California, Florida, Ohio, and Washington. And all told, these states account for about 40%, almost 50% of the prison population. So we're picking up a relatively large percentage of the state prison population. And each of these states has a variety of, more or less punitive criminal justice policies. So we have a considerable experience that we can relate to. So the one elaboration of this model is that there is one view, by the way, that says that if you have just a short prison term, by the way, the average length of a prison stay is about 2 years. So if you're in prison for longer term, there's a view that this would probably further erode your human and social capital, so that might actually lead to a diminution. So in that sense, it would be an additional prison effect, which would be the prison experience effect added just to the overall prison record effect. So we're able actually to test all of this, okay? Because what we're going to do is we're going to conduct, in this case, we're going to actually compare individuals' experiences against themselves. So we can get unemployment insurance records over the life course of these individuals. So we can tell what they were doing before they went to prison. And then, obviously, nothing while in prison. And then we can follow them after prison. So what this kind of study, you think of this as a before-after experiment. We're going to look at where they were before and where they are after, and then try to detect any change. So the secondary labor market hypothesis of the simple version would just say no change. And the prison experience version would say that their prospects actually worsened after a longer prison spell. So the finding actually was quite surprising to us. What we discovered is that employment rates and earnings bumped up, actually. They were about 3 times higher than the employment rates that these individuals had experienced prior to going to jail or prison. But, and this is the important caveat, that all of that surge in employment rates faded after about 1.5 years or 2 years. So there's this transitory increase followed by a very sharp decrease, and essentially employment rates basically fell back down to their pre-release levels. So what we don't account for, what we didn't understand, what we missed was, and this, by the way, surge was true across all 4 states. So I'm going to give you the results for Washington State because they are most illustrative. After exiting prisons, the employment rates of ex-inmates jumped by about 1/3, as I mentioned. So, and this is regardless of race and class. But then, again, regardless of race and class, they all fell sharply and returned to their pre-prison rates within 1.5 years. Moreover, we discovered that the higher post-released earnings was entirely driven by increased employment because their actual average hourly earnings fell by about 4%. So in that sense, their annual earnings fall by 4% once they return back down to their original levels. So the motivation of released prisoners may have overcome the barriers that I was discussing, but it's not easy to understand the surge and then the decline as simply a result of motivation and then its evaporation about a year or two later. So one alternative explanation focuses on the impact of parole revocation for violating the employment condition, which is typically a part of every parole agreement. Basically, you have to go to your parole officer and you have to tell him, I'm looking for jobs, right? And so in those cases, we find, and specifically in Washington and Ohio, very clear indication that once parole was over, these rates fall back down. In the Florida case, it's a little bit different. There, it turns out that we think the work release programs may have helped, but again, the impact is quite temporary. The other results that we get from these studies, we find that having a GED doesn't seem to matter, except it does kind of matter a little bit, at least temporarily, for Latino and African American released prisoners, but not for whites. The other condition, again, was just the favorable impacts of the work release, although they tend to be somewhat temporary. All right, so we conclude by just saying that basically most of these prisoners, released prisoners, basically fall into the revolving door. And so you were looking at here, and I'm going to just jump to this last. This is a recidivism study that was conducted in 2002 compared to recidivism in 1980. So it's a 1994 cohort of released prisoners, 1983. This is, again, over the decade of mass incarceration. And what you can see is, the rearrest rates after 3 years of release, about 2/3 to 3/4 for all. Conviction rates, reconviction rates for all, somewhere between 40 to 50% for pretty much all groups, regardless of crime. And then return to prison within 3 years. And again, it's about 50%. So what is striking, and the one that's most, dramatic change is actually this case of the drug offenders. And what's interesting about it is that, this distinction here is between, this is all of those who return to prison and the percentage that return to prison for a new commitment because of a new felony conviction. So the fact is the vast majority are returning to prison not because they've been arrested and prosecuted or pleaded guilty, but because they've had their parole revoked because of a technical violation. So you think of this as the Willie Horton effect, right? That prisoners on parole, if they commit, especially a heinous crime, obviously that creates a political storm. No parole officer wants to be the one responsible for that Willie Horton, who then winds up making national news. So it looks like that parole officers are now preemptively kind of suspending parole for these technical violations. And to be honest, this is really, if you go all the way back, what we know is that crime rates have fallen sharply, but this is the most recent data. Prison rates have barely budged. And so what seems to be happening now is that this technical parole, this is sometimes what Jeremy Travis calls back-end sentencing. Right? It's not sentencing in the front end by the judge or by these sentencing laws. This is the back end by parole officers that are keeping lots of people in prison. So let me just conclude by saying, what can be done besides let's have another Bill Clinton expansion, which we also realize is something of an anomaly itself. So I did look at one instance of a policy intervention called a drug court. In the case of a drug court, the kind of juggler, marginal offender, is given the option of pleading guilty typically and then basically being sentenced to a drug court where they undergo pretty much comprehensive rehabilitation programming, whether that's psychological, family counseling, job training, and sort of providing the resources. And then, the question is what happens afterwards, and we find that recidivism rates for those populations diminish quite significantly, certainly while they're still in this parole condition. Right? But actually there seem to be long-term effects that actually suggest that they're more likely to stay out of prison having gone through this experience. And when you actually do the cost-benefit analysis, which is the upfront expenditure on programming against down the road additional administrative and other costs associated with their criminal offending, you find that in fact the drug courts pay. In fact, so all these data come from a Government Accountability Office study that was based on an experiment conducted by the federal government. Congress actually authorized, to spread some of these experimental drug court treatments throughout the United States. GAO conducted its study. It found out that they passed the critical benefit cost calculation, and then Congress ended the program. Right? So, it's clearly we're in a different moment right now than when the studies were conducted, and so this is certainly, it's a marginal kind of intervention, and it really is relevant for only a relatively, it's not a trivial percentage of the prison population, but it clearly is a first step to, instead of sentencing individuals to prison, sentencing them to an alternative. And again, the more benign example of a drug court actually would expunge a prisoner's conviction. That is the plea agreement that leads them into the drug court if they successfully complete the program. So anyway, thank you for listening, and any questions I
I'll start with one, just to get things going. So basically that mass incarceration there is driven by the war on
A lot of it is the war on drugs. So again, what's hard to see here, so if you look at the prison you can't just look at the population, because the population is going to be heavily skewed towards those with very long terms, right, for more serious violent crimes. So when you look at the distribution of prisoners by, their whatever criminal offense, you'll tend to see more violent crimes. So we tend to look at the flows in and flows out. So when you look at the flows in, 30% of the growth of the prison population during this period is accounted for by the war on drugs. And again, all new admissions, something in the order of a third to 40% of new admissions were for drug violations. So it's really a substantial chunk. But again, these are folks that are typically serving 2 years, right? So they're churning in and out, And again, what's interesting, and I actually did a somewhat separate study of New York City in the early Rockefeller drug law era. And what I found was, again, what was quite striking about it was that, the Rockefeller drug laws still are some of the, they've been revised, but they were some of the most punitive drug laws, in the country. This was supposed to, ride Nelson Rockefeller to the Republican nomination, but he lost to Reagan. But anyway, turns out that, the police officers didn't want to enforce this law, and the DAs didn't want to prosecute these crimes, and the judges didn't want to they just thought this was just worthless, and then Ed Koch browbeat them all into compliance. And so, what we tend to see is actually what's driving a lot of this is starting to, prosecute and convict on crimes that typically would have been handled differently, in earlier, more, so-called permissive regimes.
If you don't mind following up, so that I just read the other day about I don't know what his skill is. He's at Fordham University, John Fatt is his name, and he's got a new book coming out arguing that that's the prosecutorial discretion is kind of like the parole officer idea that, boy, I better prosecute this person because I don't want to have somebody come along and say, why didn't you prosecute this person?
So the irony now, the origins of this sentencing, these changes in sentencing policy, sort of are termed, they're usually termed something like structured sentences, minimum mandatory sentencing, something along those lines. So the notion is to take discretion out of the hands of judges, right? And there was a great deal of evidence that judges were wielding this discretion arbitrarily and oftentimes in discriminatory fashion. So by the way, in much of what I've written, I highlight Minnesota during this period because Minnesota stood out as not the only case, but an exemplar case in which they adopted the structured sentencing, kind of reforms, but they did so to iron out the, discriminatory discretion in the sentencing, which they also successfully did, but they also put a cap on the prison population. So it is a case in which you have this kind of structured sentencing, but you don't have the mandatory minimums necessarily. And again, the goal is just to make sure that the judges are not letting white offenders off where they might, then jail or imprison black offenders. In some cases, actually being more lenient to women, so women actually suffered worse under these than men, although there were fewer women offenders. But then what winds up happening, especially with the mandatory minimums, is it moves the discretion to the DAs. So the DAs are able to hold over your head that if we prosecute you and you're found guilty, and odds are because you're going to have pretty weak representation, and needless to say, a young African-American man trying to convince a jury of his innocence is got the deck stacked against him. If we find you guilty, this is the minimum you face, so we're going to ask you to plead down, right? And so the problem with this, too, is, say, New York, it was actually quite insidious because what many didn't realize, New York actually had a two-strike law. So once you were convicted once of a felony conviction, then you became what was called a predicate felony, which is a felon with a prior conviction. And then the mandatory minimums just increase astronomically if you are convicted on that second. So in fact, what the prosecutors are doing is they're actually luring you down this road. And it doesn't really matter what that second felony conviction is once you get two strikes, really. Yeah.
So the big climb starts in 1976 and then really starts up in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
What would have happened to many of those people before that point in time who committed comparable offenses?
Well, you know, the interesting case here is actually marijuana. You know, I mean, so in the 1950s, so I didn't realize this basically is sort of, this was actually, you know, drug laws were basically targeting African-American musicians, right? And so it turns out there's just, you know, rating, I mean, the number of especially jazz musicians who find themselves, in blues musicians who find themselves in jail because they violated drug laws, right? And so you have all these get tough drug laws, and then all of a sudden in the 60s, when college students start using, you know, drugs like marijuana, next thing you know, some of them get arrested. So there's really, I mean, I love Chris Dodd, but there's just this one of these quotations in the Senate debate over the marijuana laws where Chris Dodd is saying, oh my goodness, they're arresting our children. Our children.
Our children.
Right? And that's all of a sudden, next thing you know, a lot of these marijuana laws are sort of written, revised from, you know, felony down to misdemeanor, you know, kinds of offenses. And so there is this, you know, this elasticity, if you will, in the ways in which, you know, the laws are written and what is considered deviance or not, and how harshly it's prosecuted. So let me just say, there's a very unfortunate, Alfred Bloomstein is a criminologist, famous criminologist at Carnegie Mellon. So he and a co-author, writing right around this period of time, they write this article called The Relative Stability of U.S. Employment, Incarceration Rates. So this is not the kind of thing you ever want to do as an academic, right? Right? But it is remarkably stable. It does go up and down. But notice, for example, this is the Great Depression. So a period of time when you would expect to see lots of crime and possibly lots of incarceration, you know, it's a relatively small, not trivial, but relatively small bump up. And even so, for example, this is the period of the stagflation. So for me, it's not even obvious to me as a kind of counterfactual, looking at this as an economist, I think, is this just another incident like this? Because there's a great deal of turbulence in the U.S. economy. And under normal circumstances, we would have just gone right, if we had had the old laws, we would have gone right back down. But then, you know, you get Reagan, and Reagan then really champions this war on drugs. And next thing you know, and the federal government, right, I mean, most prisoners are in state prisons, but the federal government is leading the way. It's kind of setting a template, and it's also providing lots of inducements. So, of course, the, you know, infamous case here, 1995, is the truth in sentencing, which is in the Clinton administration. Right? And so, again, the federal government can't mandate what states do, but it can tell them that if, in fact, you insist that all prisoners serve 85% of their sentence, at least, in prison, and if you do, we will give you all sorts of goodies like, you know, lots of heavy artillery and, you know, and all of these armed vehicles, you know, this kind of, you know, then, you know, we'll give you money to expand your police forces and so forth. Right? So they're basically, there's a lot of inducements for states to follow the federal lead. And the other thing that happens during this period is really a fabulous study by a political scientist whose name I'm going to forget at the moment. But again, she just looks at the, you know, what comes first, right? Popular concern about crime or politicians, you know, kind of jumping on the get tough on crime bandwagon. And so she sort of tracks this over time in a statistical study, and she finds that basically, it's the political rhetoric that tends to lead the change in the general social survey evidence on, you know, popular concern about crime. So again, that becomes another issue, and next thing you know, populations are responding, and the governments are responding, but basically it's like in an echo chamber, they're responding to their own rhetoric in a certain sense. Yeah.
It's an uncomfortable question. Sorry about it, I can't help it. I was thinking of a country like Holland, and I wonder what legalization of drugs would change this and what the consequences would be. It's a very uncomfortable situation.
Yeah, it is.
The question is, I'm not sure about it, you know, but I just can't help.
No, I understand. So let me just say, so legalization of drugs doesn't mean that drugs are sold in an open market. So, you know, we legalize the sale of certain, actually narcotic drugs over the counter through prescription, some successfully controlled and some not. But let me show you an example where it really would matter. So come back to this particular. So, when we look at the surge of, again, this is violent crime, and there's this really surge of this fatal handgun crime. And what's interesting, again, just thinking about in terms of politics, here you have lots of, white suburbanites worried about this problem when it's basically, and is properly characterized as black-on-black violence, typically, of those in the drug trade themselves. So if you actually provide, and again, it could be through some kind of prescription sort of system, access to certain drugs, you're basically going to essentially increase the supply of these drugs in a legal market. You're going to diminish its value in the black market. And as a result, you're going to basically deprive the gangs of just the wherewithal that sustain. And so, right? So that is just, one immediate consequence, is that what made this thing work so well, and this is actually part of the problem, by the way, of getting tough on crime, because oftentimes you get tough on crime, you round up like one drug gang, which means that you open up a whole new market area for other drug gangs to come in. And when we used to use the terminology cutthroat competition in economics, right? So in this case, it's like literally true, right? They're killing each other to basically corner these markets. So partly you're trying to do is just to destroy the economic incentive, right, for the drug gangs to kind of sort of operate, in these urban places.
Are there studies in popular arts that is about drug crime in
Yeah, there is, yeah. Well, I'll just tell you something. I mean, I was really shocked by this, actually, because I had done a little bit of, reading on this, because I was just thinking about, okay, so what do they do elsewhere? Like, what does life look like in other places? And so I'm not going to remember all the thing that stuck out in my mind most was that in Germany, you're convicted of homicide and you spend 15 years in jail. That's it, right? So you compare that to the United States. Actually, you can spend 15 years in jail for a drug crime, right? But for their view is that 15 years with rehabilitation and just normal desistance, right? Aging out of those, kind of impulsive, more criminogenic years of your life, and then you go back into society. And and what we have individuals sort of wallowing away in prison. Now, we're not saying not to send them to prison. Actually, I was giving a presentation at Swarthmore on this material, and someone asked me, "What about the just abolish prison movement?" And I thought, well, that's a step. I'm not proposing that. I think there are clearly, there are reasons for imprisoning, but the question is how you imprison and what's the goal. And so these are punishments that have no obvious rationale one way or the other, except retribution possibly. And but it's not even just retribution; it's more than that. So many historians and political scientists have characterized this as sort of moral panics, in which there's just kind of rampant anxiety for whatever reason, sometimes having little to do with the actual criminal activity that is being targeted. But this becomes, in effect, the focal point of that anxiety, and sort of getting tough on crime is seen as a way of reestablishing order in what looks like a kind of disorderly society. So again, it's the Koch case is the one that I was kind of interested in. This is a really fabulous book called The Bronx is Burning, which you may have seen the ESPN miniseries, which makes it out to be like a sports story. It's not a sports story at all. Really, it's a story about politics and how is it that Ed Koch, rather than Bella Abzug, became mayor of New York. And the answer is what happened when, there was, some guy operating, a kind of transmission sort of center in upstate New York, spills coffee on the board, short circuits the system, and the lights go out. And next thing you know, all hell breaks loose, in the Bronx. And this kind of, the seeming disorder when all of a sudden, the veneers of civilization disappear. And Koch was able to ride that sense that New York was falling apart. And if we just get tough on crime, right, that's going to sort of bring New York back in some fashion. And so, you can have sensible policies, but the way to have sensible policies is you've got to, you draw on the experience of other countries, which actually do have sensible policies. They have a great deal of experience with rehabilitation programming. Right, and you can then sort of using research and the research as the guide to, and the one thing you can say, it's like the infamous crack cocaine, powder cocaine differential. There was no research on that. In fact, interesting, again, what I found, others, again, reading the literature, the pharmacologists started researching the question is, do they have different psychotropic policy, impacts only after the law was passed, because they thought, oh, this is an interesting question. Is there any, really medical rationale behind the law? And the answer was, when they found no, absolutely, they're basically identical. So what you see is policy being driven, in part, you guys say by ideology. The criminal justice policy, rather than by any sort of careful analysis of, what the causes and the effective punishments for different crimes. Yeah.
I was thinking just with the idea of legalization, instead of that, possibly the decriminalization of drugs as a way of like being more, at least in the current political climate, trying to still accomplish the same goals, but without that possible shot in the foot of legalizing drugs. Do you think that would have kind of the same effect as legalization and taking away the majority of the incentive for gangs and violent crime surrounding drugs?
Yeah. Again, the trouble with the notion of legalization, it's in some ways it's an open-ended, sort of policy suggestion, because there are degrees of legalization. And so you have to ask yourself, but again, you can look at the experience in other countries, and even now we're starting to see cumulative experience in the United States, because certainly on the marijuana front, we're now beginning to see there's a range of experiences across different cities and states, depending on their laws. So it's just hard for me. I must say I'm actually right now I'm working more on monetary unification in the United States, and I am thinking about these questions. But I still think this is these are open questions that many are beginning to ponder. And so again, you just need to be able to say, well, what do we know about legalization? So we may not want to basically turn marijuana into the equivalent of Coca-Cola, in which you can just buy a 6-pack at your local store. But nonetheless, we also may not want to make it a felony crime used for what's called the recreational use, I guess. Recreational use of marijuana.
You suggested a hypothesis to me that I'm not sure could be pursued empirically, but I'd like to bounce it off of you and see if it has any virtue. I've been spending the last couple of months reading literature of the American Christian right and the family values crowd and the victory in 1976, which is interesting, your diagram of the New Christian Right, Goldwater Right faction of the Republicans, almost nominated Reagan, Waterford in 1980. They did. And Reagan did a lot of peculiar rhetorical posturing that seemed to deploy the sort of language of pollution and defilement rather than utilitarian calculus of cause and events that activated this pernicious immigration policy that seemed to be predicated on the notion that all of these diseased brown people were swarming across the border like locusts. And some of his speeches spoke of, there's one that he gave to a gathering of police chiefs in 1981. And at the end of it, he said, as far as family values go, sort of a tossed off introductory parenthetical observation, those who still have true family morality can contain the violent impulses that haunt our species. But those who don't threaten to unleash the jungle. He says this right after the riots.
So that's exactly,
One of the hypotheses that occurred to me is that this fascinating contrast between the U.S. and its exceptionalism and the Europeans. I cannot recall an equivalent movement of militant moralism in the European societies that we had. And it appears to me that we're getting sort of feedback and crosstalk between concern about abortion and women's equality and the rest of that, societal disorder in general, and the need to crack down on these people
Yeah.
because there's no reasoning with
Yeah.
it. If you could actually come up with a metric for that moralistic rhetoric, do you think such a hypothesis might be confirmed by the data?
Well, so, I mean, so the closest I came, so when we start, kind of talking about that, the rhetoric, referring to that rhetoric, I immediately, the first, thought that came to my mind was super predators. Right? So that is actually the way it got eventually formulated as super predators, of course, which is something that Hillary had to walk back. Right? So, I mean, and in a way, the super predator notion is actually the culmination of that line of reasoning, which is that these are the products of single parent families because, and then you could add, whatever you want to say, promiscuity, flawed welfare policies that encouraged, poor women to have babies, blah, 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 on and on and on. So there is actually, so it turns out that two demographers conducted a very simple study. So it was nothing like what we did in our studies. If you open up these books, you'll see they're rife, not just with lots of data tables like this, but complicated statistical models and this, This was actually nothing like that. It was really looking at the surge in gun violence around the crack epidemic. And what they found was that if you look at, the violent offenders in that moment by cohort, by age cohort, you saw that surge in violent offending across all cohorts. But we know the older cohorts, right, were not super predators, right? So they really were. There's a moment in time when we started to see this rise in, children born to single mothers in inner cities. And so, but there was no difference across. And so you'd say, so their view is this is not a generational issue. This is an episodic issue. This is about the moment in time. And yet, in that, see, that's the reality, and then the reality gets distorted through this rhetoric, all right? So it doesn't exactly get at your point, but it sort of gets at your point in the sense that we can say, okay, if you think it's because of this general moral decay, then let us try to find the evidence of this general moral decay rather than just talk about, the welfare queen, which sort of whatever anecdotal examples you might want to sort of surface. And so that, I think, that's the job of the empirical social scientist. And so that's also something that, that was a Russell Sage, that's what we champion. That's, that's my new mantra, sort of our empirical reasoning center, is we want, we're not, we like to tell stories, and you even think certain anecdotes matter. Actually, I think most potently what we didn't understand at the time when we wrote all of our studies, we simply thought we would give them all this comprehensive and serious systematic statistical analysis, and then someone comes around and tells a story, and next thing you know, they carry the day. And what you realize is that our job is to provide the storytellers, right, with the evidence to demonstrate that their stories are the right stories, right? It's not just an anecdote that's snatched out of the bag just to kind of justify a prior ideological position, but this is illustrative of what we understand to be the general patterns and trends. And so we've gotten a bit smarter in our rhetoric, but always fortified by our careful, systematic, empirical research. And so I think that's what we can do. That's how we work together. You tell here's the rhetorical stories, and now let's come back and see. Do we see what are the empirical implications of these claims? And now let's go see if we can find evidence for this. And if not, what is going on, and then how can we understand that? But again, told as a compelling narrative rather than statistically significant coefficients on a regression equation. I'll say that is a sort of a sobering thing when I realize, it's like, I did think, naively, I was, that we would carry the day, and we were kind of sit there and we're out in the desert, basically, the Israelites, kind of wandering around. But what was interesting to me, and I don't really even know how how to actually kind of reconcile myself to this. It's not until the fiscal crisis following the financial and economic crisis, 2008, that you start to see state government policymakers and federal policymakers sort of look to the criminal justice system for budget cuts, and then begin to draw on the research that we did. And they did, by the way, I will just say, as the Vindication Congress commissioned the National Academies of Science to conduct kind of serious overview of the research on this, and one of the lead researchers in our working group was actually one of the editors of that, or kind of co-organizers of that project. And so many of our researchers were there. And fortunately, when the moment came, right, seized the day, we had the research, right? But of course, we didn't determine the agenda, right? It wasn't our agenda setting that put the research on the table. It was just external events that then made this an opportune time for this research. So again, I just realized I kind of grew up actually and said, okay, I understand that now is the reality. And so you always want to have the systematic research, just so when the time comes, you're actually able to, step in and actually say something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned mandatory minimums, parole officers, and then also DAs, like being all pressured to incarcerate people. Did you find any evidence of, or did you find anything pointing to the privatization of prisons and the increase in inmates?
Yeah. So, I've always, I always say it because I've on and off, I've talked to students about this. A little bit less so recently because, again, I'm just kind of no longer in the forefront of doing the work in this area. And I've always been intrigued by the fact that many student groups really fixate on the private prison population. So I checked this number, about somewhere around 6 to 10% of all prisoners are in private prisons. So quantitatively speaking, we didn't really focus on private prisons. Same way we didn't really focus on females and women in prison, because why? Because about 90% of all prisoners are men. Now that's partly strategic in terms of data analysis. You get more observations with men, but it's also, that's really was the bulk of the problem. Although increasingly women are starting to catch up, so that's gender equality, right? The kind of, but it's still a gap. So the bottom line, it's not actually all that, it's not all that large, it's not all that. So if you really want to understand where the political pressure is to keep the prisons open and to keep the, the prisoners, in the prisons as opposed to releasing them, it's coming from prison guards and the unions of prison guards working in the public sector. So you see this like in New York State. So New York State has actually led the way. Part of the the decline in the incarceration rate. I'm proud to say that Cuomo administration and has actually taken steps to really kind of reform the Rockefeller drug laws and all the sentencing laws that have really pushed up the incarceration rate in New York State. So you see the real with the drop in crime rates and less severe punishment, you've seen sharp drops in the prison population, and they want to close down these prisons. And next thing you know, you've got state legislative, some members of our assembly from those areas, and the unions pretty much lobbying, because if you close down prisons in some of these communities, there is nothing left. And here's the irony, is you have basically a bunch of underemployed, people of color in cities like New York, right, who are being sent upstate basically to provide jobs for what would otherwise be a bunch of underemployed, less skilled, less educated, white individuals there. And so no one wants to sort of throw people out of work, but there's got to be a better way. And somehow by building and staffing prisons, keeping that kind of pipeline operating. And so that's the problem, is that it would take resources, restructuring resources that should be devoted to, neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, but as well as, what were upstate manufacturing towns that have been devastated by kind of the deindustrialization. I mean, just to give you, I don't know if you've come across this $1 million block. Have you? I don't know. So they actually cost. So like they took a block, and some guys took this block in Brooklyn, and they sort of, you looked at the number of individuals on that block, roughly speaking, who had been in prison, and how much it cost to imprison them. It was roughly about $1 million per block. And all you could think of is, what if you're taking that $1 million actually and like rehab the block, right? Yeah, it seems like a no-brainer, but of course, that $1 million is actually providing jobs and improving communities in another location, right? And it is part of the inequality built into the American political system, which is that the representation of rural communities, not only at the federal level, but in the rural and the state levels as well, is much greater, disproportionate to the representation, especially because a lot of the folks in these inner city communities just don't vote. So it reinforces the problem.
Thank you for visiting with us. We can ask more questions.
Yeah, I'm Yeah, thank you.